If someone told you that you could lose your entire identity inside your own marriage and not notice until the day you were asked to prove your worth, would you believe them? That's where my story begins, in a quiet house that looked peaceful from the outside, and in a marriage that seemed steady until the moment it wasn't. For years, I lived beside a man who spoke confidently about what he provided, while I held the paperwork, the pay stubs, the late-night shifts, the quiet sacrifices that kept our life from unraveling. None of it mattered, until the day he claimed I had never contributed at all. That accusation didn't just sting. It shook something awake in me. Suddenly, I found myself alone in the garage, surrounded by boxes of forgotten records and dusty memories. What I uncovered there wasn't just proof, it was a revelation. It forced me to confront the years I had spent shrinking myself, smoothing the truth, letting silence rewrite who I was. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became. The marriage I thought I knew had been standing on the unsteady ground of pride, fear, and denial. But this isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about clarity. About the quiet strength that rises only after you stop apologizing for your own truth. It's about what happens when you finally gather the courage to face someone you once loved, not to hurt them, but to stop letting them hurt the truth. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told you were less, this story will feel achingly familiar. And if you've ever found yourself rebuilding from the inside out, step by steady step, then you already know how powerful the quiet moments can be. Stay with me. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that hit where it matters. The garage light flickered once, just one sharp pulse, before settling into its usual dull hum. I stared at my phone, at the message that had landed like a thrown stone. "You lived off me for 5 years." My thumb went numb before the rest of me caught up. It was the kind of accusation that didn't feel new. It felt recycled, dug up from the quieter rot of our marriage. A bruise pressed again. I could almost hear the stale echo of his old comments, the way he'd say them casually, as if he were brushing lint off his shirt. "I carried us. You barely helped." Back then, I'd swallow it, thinking silence kept the peace. Now in the sharp garage air, that silence felt like a poor investment. I held the phone tighter, watching my hand tremble. Not from surprise, but from the recognition that this story he was trying to tell wasn't the truth. It was the version he liked because it made him feel taller. And for years I had let him. The light buzzed above me, steady now, as if waiting to see what I would do next. I turned toward the stacked boxes along the garage wall. Brown cardboard, taped edges, labels written in my handwriting from different years. I knew exactly which one I needed. The box with the work documents sat half hidden behind a cooler we rarely used anymore. Dust coated the top like a thin winter crust. I dragged it forward, feeling the gentle scrape across concrete. Under the garage light, the edges of the folders glinted faintly, almost metallic. It struck me how something so quiet, so unimpressive, could hold the entire counterweight to a lie. My breath fogged slightly in the chilled air as I knelt down. Inside, the neatly clipped pay stubs, HR letters, tax forms, each one a small piece of a life I had worked to build, even when no one cared to look. I traced a finger along the top folder. The paper felt cool, crisp, almost relieved to be touched again after so long. It looked like evidence waiting to stretch its legs. The thought startled me. I had spent years shrinking so he could take up more space. Now these documents seemed to say, "Stand up." A memory tugged at me, the first year of our marriage, when we were still warm, still naive enough to believe effort alone could keep two people stitched together. I had worked mornings at the clinic and evenings at the diner that winter, juggling shifts like mismatched puzzle pieces, because his old truck had broken down 3 times in 1 month. I remember counting tips in the dark living room, my shoes still on, my shoulders aching. He'd come in, sit beside me, kiss my temple, and say, "I don't know how you do it. Thank you." And I believed him. Believed we were a team. Believed gratitude had a long shelf life. But somewhere along the way, the thank yous expired. He began to forget who paid which bill, who stayed up late filling out insurance forms, who picked up extra hours when he was too tired or too proud to take small jobs. The forgetting wasn't sudden, it was slow, like a fog thickening month by month. By year 5, he talked as though I'd always been sitting at home, cushioned by his effort. The revision of history was almost elegant in how confidently he told it. I slid the top folder out and flipped it open. The W-2s lay inside, crisp, dated, irrefutable. My name printed cleanly in bold at the top. Each line of income like a quiet heartbeat. I held one up to the garage light, letting it illuminate the numbers. There was something grounding in the weight of the paper, thin but firm enough to remind me I wasn't imagining my own contribution. For years I had handled paperwork the way other people handled family photos. Carefully, reverently. That habit, mocked more than once by him, was now the thing steadying me. I ran my thumb along the margin, noticing the faint indentation from where I had clipped it together years earlier. The air smelled faintly of motor oil and cold concrete. I breathed it in, feeling a strange steadiness settle into my spine. This wasn't anger. It was recognition. Recognition that evidence had a temperature, and this paper felt like the first warm thing I'd held all day. I closed the folder, pressing my palm on top of it for a few seconds, as if sealing an intention into place. The message he had sent still hovered in my mind, not because it hurt, but because it revealed something I hadn't wanted to admit. I had let him narrate parts of my life for far too long. My silence had been convenient for both of us, easier than conflict, easier than correcting every subtle dismissal. But silence collects interest, and here I was, standing in a cold garage, holding the proof I should have shown years ago. I whispered softly, "I won't let this story get rewritten again." The words surprised me. They weren't sharp. They weren't bitter. They were tired, honest, and finally, mine. For the first time in a long while, I felt the edge of a decision forming, clean and unmistakable. I lifted the stack of documents from the box, feeling their combined weight settle into my arms. It wasn't heavy, but it felt consequential, like placing a hand on a doorknob you've avoided for years. The wooden work table stood a few feet away, the surface worn smooth from old projects. I walked toward it slowly, steadying my breath. When I set the folders down, the sound was soft but final, like a quiet punctuation mark. I stepped back, looking at them under the pale garage light. 5 years of labor, of effort swallowed and forgotten, lay there without complaint. I rested my fingertips on the table edge and let my shoulders drop. I had spent so much of my marriage stepping aside, softening myself, making room for his insecurities. But tonight, under this unglamorous light, I felt something small and firm shift inside me. Maybe for the first time, I wasn't stepping back. I had put the truth on the table, literally, and I wasn't afraid of what it meant anymore. The email came in at 8:12 p.m., the timestamp glowing like a small warning light. He had written 4 dense paragraphs about his emotional contributions, the phrase so carefully chosen it almost felt rehearsed. I read each line slowly, letting the cold detachment of his tone settle around me. It sounded less like a man defending himself, and more like someone scrambling to rebuild a version of the past that suited him better. He listed moments where he claimed to have guided me, supported me, carried the mental load. Yet every example he gave was thin, stretched, or simply imagined. What struck me most wasn't the content, but the desperation threaded through the formality. A man who truly believed his story doesn't write like that. He doesn't hide behind inflated metaphors about sacrifice. My thumb hovered over the trackpad for a long moment before I finally hit save. Not reply, not delete, just save. The email wasn't an argument. It was a record. Not 15 minutes later, a message from his sister lit up my phone, followed by one from his mother, then another from an aunt I barely spoke to. The tone was identical, as if they'd all memorized the same tired script. He's the provider. Men shoulder the burden. He did everything for your household. Their words weren't just uninformed. They were inherited, passed down like old furniture no one bothered to examine. I set the phone face down on the table and exhaled slowly. The weight of their expectations had hovered over our marriage from the beginning, shaping him, shaping the way they saw me. In their eyes, a woman's contribution only counted if it was visible, loud, or entirely domestic. The quiet labor, the extra shifts, the financial planning, the steadying of a household when one partner falters, was invisible by design. Their judgments felt less personal and more cultural, a current I had been swimming against for years. I opened my laptop and created a folder titled Correspondence. Inside it, I placed screenshots of each message along with his email, neatly labeled by timestamp. It was clinical work, almost surgical in how detached it felt, but my chest tightened as I clicked through the files. These weren't just digital records. They were mirrors, held up to how little they had ever really seen me. I highlighted the timestamp of his first email, 8:12 p.m., my cursor lingering for a beat. That number would matter later, even if he didn't know it yet. Organization had always been my way of staying afloat, of keeping chaos from swallowing me whole. Tonight, it felt like armor. Still, as I organized each piece, a familiar ache pressed behind my ribs. Not because I needed validation, but because I remembered how many times I had quietly earned it. I minimized the folder and pulled up my financial logs, the ones I had kept mostly for taxes and budgeting. Line after line showed payments I'd made, mortgage contributions, utility bills, medical costs, unexpected repairs he never noticed. I highlighted the years in alternating colors to see the pattern more clearly. What emerged wasn't a pattern but a landscape, my landscape, built from unacknowledged labor. I scrolled through credit card statements with dates circled in red, remembering each moment. The dentist bill he promised he would cover but forgot. The groceries during the months he was between jobs. The rent payment during the week he said he needed to focus on his mental space. I'd carried all of it, quietly, automatically. Seeing it now in black and white, organized and undeniable, made something inside me still. I wasn't angry. I was simply done pretending the truth was negotiable. The cold air drifted through the cracked garage window, lifting a strand of hair against my cheek. I inhaled slowly, grounding myself before emotion could flood in. I didn't want to act out of bitterness or defensiveness. Those reactions had never gotten me anywhere. Tonight needed to be different. Measured, steady, deliberate. I sat back in the chair, feeling the wooden slats press against my spine, and let my breath settle. I wasn't preparing for a fight. I was preparing for accuracy. This wasn't about punishing him. It was about reclaiming the narrative he had twisted until I almost didn't recognize myself in it. I closed my eyes for a few seconds, letting the calm take shape. Emotion could wait. Truth couldn't. I opened my notebook to a fresh page, the paper smooth beneath my fingertips, and wrote a single line across the top. Use data, not pain. It was the rule I had failed to follow for years, especially in our marriage, where I let emotions soften facts until they lost their shape. But now, seated alone in the garage with the documents spread around me, I finally understood the power of precision. I jotted down the key points: income records, joint expenses, the periods he had been unemployed, the payments I alone had covered. The list grew steadily, taking on a life of its own. When I finished, I looked at the page, clean, structured, undeniable. The truth didn't need drama, it only needed daylight. I closed the notebook gently, the decision sealed. This time, I would answer his accusations the only way they could be answered, with clarity. The conference room felt colder than the hallway, a thin draft slipping beneath the door as I sat across from my attorney. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the folder I'd brought in. 5 years distilled into tidy lines of numbers and dates. When he finally looked up, his question landed with unexpected precision. Why does he believe you didn't contribute? The phrasing was gentle, but it cut deeper than anything my ex had written. I swallowed, tracing a fingertip along the edge of the table. It wasn't that I didn't know the answer. It was that saying it aloud would mean admitting I had let an untruth take root. I met my attorney's eyes and felt a quiet heaviness bloom in my chest. The question didn't accuse me. It exposed the part of the story I had never examined, the space I had left unguarded simply because it was easier that way. I breathed out slowly, preparing myself for honesty. When he lost his job, I began, my voice softer than I intended. I didn't want him to feel ashamed. The memory unfolded with uncomfortable clarity, how he'd paced the apartment, restless and humiliated, how he flinched at even gentle questions about next steps. I had taken on extra shifts quietly, told friends he was transitioning, kept our finances steady without making a sound. At the time it felt like compassion, but compassion, when left unspoken, can turn into erasure. I realized then that he hadn't lied entirely. He had simply filled in the blanks I left open. I had worked so hard to protect him from embarrassment that I had let him forget I was carrying us. My attorney nodded, not surprised, just attentive. Hearing myself say it made something inside me tighten. Silence had cost me more than I understood. So you carried the household that year, he said. Not as an accusation, but as a summary, a simple line drawn between 2 points. The word struck me harder than I expected. No one had ever framed it that plainly, not even me. I felt heat rise at the back of my throat. There was a strange grief in being recognized so clearly. Not grief for him, or even for the marriage, but for the version of myself who stayed quiet because she thought love required shrinking. My attorney leaned back, waiting, giving me space to absorb it. I pressed my palms flat on my knees, grounding myself. A person shouldn't need validation to know their own labor exists. And yet sitting there, I felt the validation settle into place like a puzzle piece I'd been missing. I opened the folder and pulled out the tax return from the year he had made no income. The zeros lined up neatly on his section, while mine filled page after page. Seeing it again, the stark numerical divide, made my breath hitch. I placed the form on the table, sliding it toward my attorney. This was the year, I said. The year he forgot. Those 12 months had been the pivot point, the quiet rewriting of our roles. I remembered the arguments where he insisted he'd always provided, and how I'd let the words pass because correcting him felt cruel. Now, under fluorescent office lighting, the truth looked impossibly simple. My attorney studied the form with a small nod. This changes the trajectory, he murmured. And I felt the weight of it, the moment where the narrative bent back toward accuracy. We spent the next half hour outlining a strategy built on numbers, methodical and emotionless. "We lead with data," he said. "No commentary, no reaction." It sounded almost clinical, but it fit the kind of strength I needed now. Emotions had clouded too much already. His shame, my empathy, our unspoken agreements. Facts would be the only steady ground left. He tapped a pen lightly against the folder. "Truth is on your side. We don't embellish it." I nodded, absorbing each word. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even defense. It was alignment. Placing the truth where it should have been all along. My chest loosened slightly, the first hint of air after holding my breath too long. When I stepped out of the building, the cool afternoon light felt softer, though the sky hadn't changed. I walked to my car with the folder clutched against my chest, a strange mixture of relief and sorrow weaving through me. Winning wasn't satisfying. It wasn't even the point. What hurt was realizing the history I had protected for us had been rewritten by him alone. No one walks into a marriage expecting to face off like strangers across a legal table. Yet here I was. I opened the car door slowly, letting the hinge's quiet creak settle in the air. I felt lighter, but not happy. The truth had been acknowledged, but the cost of reaching this point lingered. I sat behind the wheel and exhaled, steady and long. Some battles you don't choose, some you inherit from silence. My phone buzzed 3 times, precise, insistent, then fell silent. I knew that rhythm. He always tapped anger into his messages like a metronome. When I opened it, the words hit with the same dull force I'd grown used to. "I told my family everything. They all agree, you lived off me." A strange heaviness settled at the base of my throat. It wasn't rage. It was humiliation. The kind that comes from realizing someone you once trusted is now rewriting history with the confidence of a man who thinks no one will check the archives. I lowered the phone slowly and let the garage air cool my skin. It stunned me how easy it was for him to weaponize a story that had never been true. I'd spent years protecting his dignity. He spent 10 seconds erasing mine. And yet instead of anger, there was only a quiet ache, like an old bruise pressed just a little too hard. I reached for the tax folder on the work table. My name was listed as the primary filer, a fact I'd never thought much about until now. The forms crackled softly as I opened them, releasing that faint paper smell that always reminded me of January mornings spent sorting receipts at the kitchen table. Seeing the numbers laid out so plainly made something inside me tighten. There it was. The truth, steady and unembellished, printed in black ink beneath harsh fluorescent light. I traced the rows with my fingertip, remembering the late nights I'd calculated deductions while he slept, the years I'd filed our returns without a second glance from him. It felt surreal that the same man who benefited from my organization now claimed I contributed nothing. The evidence in front of me didn't shout. It didn't need to. I lifted my phone again and without hesitating took a picture of the tax form, then another of the income statements, and another of the employment verification letters. Each click of the camera sounded like a quiet decision being made. I created a new album and named it Truth. A simple word, unadorned, but enough. Saving the images felt strangely empowering, like I'd finally stopped waiting for someone else to validate what had always been real. I didn't draft a rebuttal or chase an explanation. I didn't try to correct him. Instead, I saved the proof. It was the first time in a long while I chose self-protection over peacekeeping. I slipped the phone into my pocket, letting the silence settle around me. The truth didn't need defending. It only needed preserving. A memory surfaced. 3 years into the marriage, his birthday. I had worked a double shift, grease still clinging to my sleeves from the diner, and rushed to buy the cake he liked. I remember standing in the kitchen lighting candles with tired hands when he walked in and said, "You're always free anyway." I'd laughed back then, pretending it was a joke, pretending it didn't sting. But the truth was, I'd worked 12 hours that day. I'd worked nearly every day that year, and he never asked. He simply assumed my effort cost me nothing because I never complained. That birthday cake memory lingered now, rising with a clarity that made me feel both foolish and furious in equal measure. I had mistaken silence for resilience, so had he. I sat at the work table with my laptop open and began typing a timeline, not of emotions, but of events. Dates, bills paid, hours worked, periods of unemployment, repairs handled, deposits made. Line by line, I reconstructed the history he had twisted. Seeing it laid out so clinically created a kind of distance, as if I were reviewing someone else's life. But there was relief in that distance, too. For the first time, I wasn't looking at my marriage through the haze of hope or habit. I was looking at data. And data doesn't play favorites. The more the timeline took shape, the quieter the hurt became. Truth had its own kind of calm. When I finished, I closed the laptop and rested my palms against the table's warm wood. There was no triumph in the moment, only clarity. I finally understood the depth of the lie, not because he believed it, but because I had allowed him to tell the story alone. I whispered softly, "If he wants to win by dragging my name down, then I'll stand by what's real." The words weren't a threat. They were a posture, a way of holding myself steady in a storm I didn't start, but would no longer sink into. I looked at the folders one last time, then exhaled slowly. I wasn't fighting him. I was simply refusing to disappear. His next message wasn't a question or an attempt at discussion. It was a declaration. "I want 65% of the assets. You didn't do anything important." I stared at the words, feeling neither shock nor anger, just a slow sinking recognition of how far he was willing to go to protect the version of himself he preferred. Claiming the majority wasn't strategy. It was fear masquerading as entitlement. The kind of fear that makes a person inflate their worth while shrinking yours. I set the phone down deliberately, letting the absurdity of the statement settle. After years of carrying the weight quietly, I now heard the hollow thud of his desperation. It no longer pierced me the way it once would have. Instead, I felt strangely steady, like I'd finally stepped outside the emotional fog he'd pulled me into for years. Some statements collapse on their own when exposed to daylight. I typed a simple reply. "Can you prove that?" My fingers didn't shake. There was no dramatic surge of adrenaline, just a clean, level quiet. I imagined him reading it, that brief moment where his confidence paused and his breath caught because he hadn't anticipated resistance, not from me. I had always softened my tone, padded my objections, made room for his pride even when mine thinned to nothing. But tonight, I asked a question he couldn't sidestep. The silence that followed felt different from all the silences before. It wasn't the tense quiet of conflict or the tired quiet of resignation. It was the quiet of shifting ground. For the first time, I heard myself clearly, in my own words. He responded 5 minutes later with a list of household contributions, tasks he framed as emotional labor, responsibilities he described in sweeping, abstract terms. He wrote about being the decision-maker, about guiding the tone of our home, about providing structure. The words were elegant but hollow, like furniture made from thin wood that collapses under touch. I read the message twice, and all I could think was how much effort he put into avoiding numbers. Not one figure, not one record, not one verifiable detail. It was the language of someone trying to build a case from smoke because he had nothing else to stand on. I closed the message without replying. Arguments built on feelings were the currency of our marriage. Tonight I was dealing only in facts. When I asked him, "Do you remember the year you were unemployed?" the typing bubbles appeared, disappeared, reappeared. Then the conversation shifted abruptly. He dodged. He changed subjects. He asked why I was bringing up old wounds. I watched the evasions unfold, familiar as old wallpaper. Every time accountability crept close, he found a different corner to shine the spotlight on. The question hung unanswered on the screen, but I didn't repeat it. I didn't force the point. I had learned something painfully useful in the last few days. Truth doesn't need repetition. It only needs a witness. And I was finally willing to witness my own. Instead of debating, I let silence carry the weight. It wasn't the silence I used to offer, the one meant to soothe, to keep peace, to keep him from spiraling. This silence was strategic, intentional. I closed the chat window and set the phone face down on the table, feeling a calm settle into my fingertips. I didn't need to fight him word for word. I didn't need to correct every twist of his memory. I had the documents, the records, the years in black and white. Silence, in this moment, wasn't surrender. It was the refusal to entertain a narrative that had never been true. I opened my notebook and wrote a single line. This is the pullback. Not defeat, just a step backward to gather perspective. I had learned enough about myself in this process to know I didn't need to charge forward impulsively. Every piece of evidence was already organized. Every timeline was aligned. I wasn't losing ground, I was watching him reveal his own. His panic disguised as confidence. His deflection disguised as authority. I closed the notebook gently and leaned back in my chair. Some storms don't require resistance. They exhaust themselves. And I was no longer standing in the middle of his. I found the payroll record tucked near the bottom of the folder. A sheet documenting 14 consecutive days of work with no breaks. The dates lined up like marching steps, relentless and unbroken. I remembered that stretch with an ache I hadn't let myself feel at the time. The early alarms, the late dinners eaten standing up, the nights I'd come home too tired to speak. Back then I told myself it was temporary, that marriage required sacrifice, that pushing through wasn't just necessary but noble. Looking at the page now, the devotion felt less like strength and more like neglect. Of myself, of my limits, of the voice I kept lowering so his could stay steady. My thumb grazed the inked lines and I felt a quiet mourning for the woman who believed endurance was the same as love. She had worked herself into exhaustion and no one, not even she, had stopped to ask why. I printed the document and placed it into a labeled sleeve. Year 2, workload. Naming it that felt like reclaiming something, giving shape to effort that had gone unseen. I saved the digital copy under the same title, methodical and exact. Then I paused, looking at the screen. That particular year had been the one I'd carried us through a sudden debt, an unexpected medical bill, a rental increase, the lingering cost of his long job search. I had worked double shifts and rearranged my life in small but constant ways so we wouldn't fall behind. No one had known. Certainly not him. I whispered, almost to myself. This was the year I saved our household. And the truth of it settled over me like a warm, startling realization. I wasn't rewriting history. I was finally reading it. For a moment, I let the exhaustion from those long-forgotten weeks wash over me. The bone-deep kind that doesn't ask permission. The kind that makes your body feel older than it is. I remembered stepping into the shower at midnight, counting my tip money on the bathroom counter, leaving the lights dim so he wouldn't wake. I remembered thinking, I just need to get us through this. Not to be seen, not to be thanked, just to keep us afloat. That version of myself had wanted so little. Not credit, not applause, just stability. Now, sitting alone in the garage, I realized how easy it had been for him to dismiss someone whose strength had always been quiet. Recognition wasn't something I craved, but clarity was. And clarity was finally here. I slipped the labeled sleeves into a binder, organizing each year by color-coded tabs. The order was satisfying in a way that stretched beyond neatness. It was structure, evidence of control returning to my hands. For years, I had let life pile up without sorting it, believing selflessness meant keeping things fluid, unbound. Now, as each document clicked into place, I felt something steady settle inside me. I wasn't bracing anymore. I was building. The binder grew heavier, a physical counterweight to years of emotional imbalance. If the past had been blurry, softened by compromises I couldn't articulate, it was sharp now. The room felt less like a storage space and more like an office, a place where truth was being arranged with care. A question slipped through my mind, quiet, hesitant, but honest. Was it my fault for staying silent so long? It wasn't self-blame, not exactly. It was curiosity about the part I had played in this revision of my life. I had handed him the blank spaces, trusting he'd fill them with fairness, with memory, with gratitude. Instead, he filled them with convenience. I sat with the question for a moment, letting it rest on my tongue. Then I exhaled. Silence had been my coping mechanism, not my consent. There was a difference. And I refused to punish myself for coping the only way I knew how at the time. I closed the binder slowly, running a hand along the spine. No more blaming the woman I used to be, I murmured. She had done her best with what she had, with love, with exhaustion, with hope that things would get better. She wasn't weak, she wasn't naive. She was simply trying to keep a home standing while the ground shifted beneath her feet. Tonight I wasn't fighting her. I was freeing her. The documents neatly held together now weren't relics of past suffering. They were proof that I had always shown up, even when no one was looking. I stood, stretching my back as the garage settled into a deeper quiet. I was ready for whatever came next, not because I finally had evidence, but because I finally had myself. He showed up at the garage unannounced, the door creaking as he pushed it open halfway. "We need to talk," he said. But the assertiveness he used to wield like armor wasn't there. He looked worn, eyes tired, shoulders slumped, jaw tight in a way that betrayed more insecurity than anger. For a moment neither of us moved. The air between us felt heavier than the boxes stacked behind me. He stepped closer, glancing at the work table covered in documents. His gaze lingered on the binders, on the neat rows of evidence he didn't yet know existed. "You've made this into something bigger than it is," he muttered, but even he didn't sound convinced. I watched him, noticing how small he seemed without the protection of his narrative. A man stripped of the story he relied on is a man standing in the dark. He repeated one of his familiar refrains, "You stayed home all the time," though his tone lacked its old edge. It came out soft, almost pleading, as if he needed it to be true. But his eyes darted away the second they landed on the folders. I didn't respond immediately. I let the silence stretch just long enough for the contradiction to settle between us. He shifted his weight, uneasy. For years, he'd relied on the idea that I wouldn't challenge him, that I'd smooth over tension with a laugh or an apology, or a gentle explanation. Standing there now, I felt none of those impulses. I only felt the quiet steadiness of someone who finally understood the value of her own memories. I reached for one of the binders and laid it open on the table. "This is year 3, I said calmly. The payroll records, tax documents, and shift schedules lay in neat rows. I worked 2 jobs that year. He blinked, thrown off balance. "You never told me," he said. But it wasn't an accusation, it was disbelief. "You never asked," I replied. The simplicity of the exchange hit harder than any argument could. His shoulders sagged, and for a brief moment, He looked like a man realizing he'd missed entire chapters of a book he thought he wrote. He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture he used to make when he felt the truth cornering him. His frustration took over quickly. "You're doing too much, making me out to be the bad guy," he snapped, though the anger sounded thin. The defensiveness was familiar, almost predictable, an instinct he reached for when facts narrowed his escape routes. "I'm not making you anything," I said. "I'm just showing you what's real." The words landed with a dull weight. He turned away for a moment, jaw clenched, staring at the garage floor like he hoped it would offer him a different version of the past. I watched him inhale sharply, his breath shaky. He wasn't used to being confronted with the parts of our life he had conveniently forgotten. He shot back, "You think this makes you better than me?" The question was raw, vulnerable in a way he probably didn't intend. I shook my head slowly. "Not better," I said. "Not worse. Just accurate." That earned a flicker of something behind his eyes. Anger, maybe? Or shame? Or the uncomfortable blending of both? He shifted again, arms crossed, trying to reclaim a posture of authority that no longer fit. For a moment, I saw the man I used to love. The man who had once tried, who had once meant well. But I also saw the man who could not bear to look at his own reflection unless it flattered him. And I understood then that this conversation wasn't about who was right. It was about who could face the truth without running. He left the garage with footsteps heavier than when he arrived, each step dragging a little, like he was carrying something he didn't want to admit existed. I didn't follow him. I didn't call after him. I didn't feel the need to soften the moment or apologize for defending myself. I stayed where I was, beside the table, breathing slowly as the quiet wrapped around me again. This wasn't victory. It wasn't triumph. It was simply clarity settling into the space he'd just vacated. I looked at the open binder, its pages still illuminated by the pale overhead light, and felt myself steady. He had walked away unsure. I was standing exactly where I needed to be. The phone call came late, the kind that rings with urgency even before you answer. A mutual friend's voice broke through, hesitant, almost apologetic as he explained that my ex had taken out loans during the year he was unemployed. Loans he'd never told me about. Loans he was now struggling to manage. I felt my breath catch, not from anger, but from the unexpected sting of sympathy. Dad explained the frantic energy behind his accusations, the sudden aggression wrapped in false certainty. It painted a picture of a man cornered by choices he hadn't been brave enough to admit. I sat down slowly, feeling the cold edge of the work table press into my palms. The information didn't excuse anything, but it illuminated the shadows. For the first time, I saw his fear clearly, not as an enemy, but as a mirror reflecting the insecurity he'd buried for years. I lowered the phone, letting the silence settle. My hands trembled, not from rage, but from a soft, disorienting sadness. I remembered the man he was in our first years, the one who tried, who wanted to be enough. I'd watched him lose confidence with every failed application, every rejection that bruised him deeper than he admitted. Hearing about the loans made something inside me ache. It wasn't love. It wasn't longing. It was the complicated grief of seeing someone you once knew collapse under a weight you didn't know they carried. I pressed my fingers against my eyelids, steadying myself. Compassion and boundaries could coexist, but the line between them was delicate tonight. Still, sympathy didn't erase reality. I straightened in my chair, letting my spine lengthen as clarity returned. Feeling sorry for him wasn't the same as letting him rewrite the truth. There was a difference between understanding someone's pain and permitting them to weaponize it. I exhaled slowly. His debt explained his desperation, but it didn't make his accusations true, nor his actions fair. I turned back to the folders on the table. the documents that reflected 5 steady years of my effort. They were unmoved by emotion, untouched by pity. Facts didn't bend because circumstances were difficult. I reached out and aligned the edges, grounding myself in the quiet discipline they represented. I could hold compassion without losing myself. I gathered the documents needed for the upcoming mediation and placed them into a clean envelope: tax forms, pay stubs, employment letters, and the newly organized binder pages. Each item slid in with a crisp rustle, the sound of preparation rather than retaliation. My movements were calm, measured. I wasn't assembling ammunition, I was assembling truth. The difference mattered to me. I sealed the envelope and wrote the mediator's name across the front in steady handwriting. This wasn't about proving him wrong anymore. It was about setting the record straight, for myself as much as for the legal process. I inhaled the faint scent of paper and cardboard around me, the grounded smell of order, not chaos. For a fleeting moment, doubt brushed against me. A small voice whispered, "Wouldn't it be easier to surrender, to give him what he wants and finally be done?" I closed my eyes, letting the question settle. I imagined handing over more than half the assets just to escape the conflict. Imagined the temporary relief of silence returning. But then I saw myself months later, resentful, diminished, erased all over again. I had spent years shrinking to keep peace. I wouldn't shrink again now, not when the truth was so clear. I opened my eyes and let the doubt pass like a passing draft. Ease and integrity rarely walked the same path. Then, like a slide clicking into place, another memory surfaced. The night he called me a burden in front of his relatives, dismissing the work I did as if it were air. I'd stood there, heat gathering behind my eyes, unable to defend myself without being labeled dramatic. That moment, long buried, rose now with sharp clarity. It steadied me. I stood, gathering the envelope and binder with a sense of decisiveness that felt unfamiliar but right. Whatever grief lingered for what we once were, it didn't outweigh the truth of what he'd become. I lifted my chin, breathed deeply, and felt determination replace sympathy. I wasn't choosing conflict. I was choosing myself. I sat at the kitchen counter the next morning with my laptop open, logging into the joint account we'd once managed side by side. The login felt mechanical, something my hands remembered even when my mind hesitated. Once inside, the numbers told a story far more honest than either of us ever had. Transaction after transaction appeared, my paychecks landing regularly, his sporadic contributions spaced months apart. Rent payments pulled from my income, car repairs, groceries, medical bills, holiday expenses, almost all of it traced back to me. I clicked through the statements slowly, feeling the quiet steadiness of confirmation instead of the sting of surprise. It was like watching a film I'd already seen but forgotten entire scenes from. I highlighted each month, one by one, marking any deposit I made in red. By the time I reached the end, the timeline looked like a field of crimson. The truth was loud in its consistency. I printed 18 months' worth of statements, laying them across the table like cards in a game no one ever wanted to play. Each page landed with a small, papery thud, a rhythm of accountability. The red marks looked almost aggressive against the white paper, but there was no aggression in me, just clarity. I lined them up in order, noticing how the red intensified during his unemployment, how the expenses spiked during his job search, how my checks carried us through each unpredictable month. Seeing it all laid bare made me sit back, palms flat against the cool table surface. This wasn't self-righteousness. It wasn't vindication. It was simply a reminder that memory is often merciful, and numbers are not. A ping from my phone broke the quiet. His name lit up the screen again with a new message. I won't agree to a 50-50 split. No explanation, no evidence, just resistance. I stared at the words, my breathing slow and measured. I typed a reply that was shorter than the breath it took to write it. Then show proof. No accusations, no emotion. Only a request he couldn't fulfill. I set the phone aside and felt a steady calm rise from somewhere deep. For years I had argued with emotion, hoping he'd meet me halfway. Now I was asking him to meet me in the place he'd avoided most: facts. And the silence that followed wasn't threatening, it was revealing. Hours passed without a response, and with every minute of quiet I sensed the truth closing in around him. This wasn't the comfortable silence of our past, where I filled the gaps with forgiveness and excuses. This was the silence of someone cornered by their own story. I imagined him scrolling through his memories, searching for evidence that didn't exist, trying to reconcile the version of himself he needed to believe with the one the documents would expose. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindictive. I felt a slow, cooling sadness, an acknowledgement that the man I once loved wasn't malicious. He was lost in a narrative built on insecurity and denial, and now it was unraveling. I leaned back, looking at the spread of papers across the table, the sheer volume of quiet effort that had gone unseen. Oddly, I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even hurt. A kind of acceptance washed over me, not of his accusations, but of the truth that our marriage had been unbalanced long before the paperwork proved it. He had clung to a sense of superiority because he needed it to survive his own disappointments. I had let him because conflict felt heavier than misrepresentation. Now, facing it all plainly, I understood that neither of us had known how to tell the truth without fear. I gathered the statements into a folder, aligning the edges with deliberate care. This is the core of it, I murmured to myself. Not the accusations, not the anger, not even the legal process ahead. The core was the quiet recognition that I had carried more than my share for years, and had done it so silently that he mistook my endurance for absence. I closed the folder firmly, feeling its weight settle into my hands. The first peak of this long journey was behind me. I wasn't climbing toward victory. I was climbing toward clarity, and I could finally see the ridgeline ahead. I inhaled deeply, letting the realization sink in. The truth wasn't loud, but it was steady enough to stand on. The envelope felt heavier than it should as I handed it to my attorney later that week. Inside were the documents I'd spent nights assembling. Income records, tax forms, bank statements, the binder organized down to the smallest detail. "This is everything," I said. He opened it on the table, scanning the contents with sharp, deliberate eyes. The fluorescent light caught the edges of the pages, making them look almost clinical. "This is solid," he murmured, tapping a finger against a line of income figures. "If he can't provide matching documentation, the case leans significantly in your favor." His voice was calm, not triumphant. I appreciated that. This wasn't a victory lap. It was the quiet acknowledgement of reality asserting itself. As he reviewed the material, I felt something in me shift. Not relief exactly, but a soft release of tension that had been threading through my spine for months. Facts were no longer just memories. They were now evidence, gently as though handling something fragile. "I want you to prepare for his response," he said. "When someone feels cornered, they grasp at anything that resembles pride." I nodded. I had already seen glimpses of that, his deflections, his inflated claims of mental contributions, his refusal to acknowledge the year he had no income. Still, hearing it framed so plainly made the situation feel less personal, more procedural. My attorney leaned forward, his hands folded. "The legal standard is simple. Verifiable contributions. If he doesn't have them, he can't claim them." The simplicity of it settled over me like a calming tide. For so long, he had tangled emotion into every disagreement until I couldn't tell which part belonged to me. Now the ground felt clearer. I wasn't navigating feelings anymore. I was navigating facts. When I stepped outside the building, the afternoon light filtered through thin clouds, tinting everything with a cold, pale brightness. I paused on the sidewalk, clutching my coat tighter around me. Despite the attorney's assurance, a quiet emptiness settled beneath my ribs. It wasn't doubt. It was the hollow recognition that even when truth was on my side, the process carried its own weight. Winning didn't feel like triumph. It felt like watching the unraveling of something that once meant safety. I took a slow breath, letting the chilly air fill my lungs. The truth didn't erase the years we had shared or the hope I once carried. It only reframed them, and reframing came with its own grief. Back home, I laid out the timeline again, smoothing the pages with methodical care. Each date, each note, each printed document fell into place like a report prepared for an audit. I took out a ruler and lined up the sheets, adjusting any crooked edge. The precision grounded me. The more orderly the papers became, the calmer I felt. It occurred to me then that I wasn't preparing these for him or for the mediator. I was preparing them for myself. For the version of me who had lived through those years and doubted her own memory because someone else insisted on a different story. The structure felt like closure taking shape. I emailed the mediator to confirm the next session, my fingers steady on the keyboard. "I'll bring all supporting documents," I wrote. The reply came quickly, polite and concise. "Understood. We'll review contributions from both parties." I stared at the words for a moment. Contributions from both parties. I wondered, briefly, what his folder would look like. Thin, perhaps, or filled with notes instead of numbers. I didn't feel smug, just contemplative. The process was no longer about disproving him. It was about aligning the story with reality, and reality had been waiting quietly for me to name it. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, letting my eyes rest on the binder at the center of the table. A single thought settled across my mind with an unexpected warmth. I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of the mediation, not of his accusations, not of the narrative he had clung to so desperately. Fear had kept me silent in the marriage. Fear of conflict, of hurting his pride, of upsetting a balance that was never balanced to begin with. Now, the silence I carried was different. It was deliberate, steady, unshaken. I stood, gathering the binder with a firmness that felt new. Whatever came next, I was ready. Truth has a way of quieting everything around it. The first message came from his mother, a short, clipped line. "You're tearing the family apart." Another followed from his aunt, then his cousin, each one echoing the same condemnation, as if grief were a script passed around the table. I read them without flinching. Their disappointment wasn't new. It had simply found a fresh angle. Still, a small heaviness settled in my chest. I had once considered them my own family, shared holidays, cooked meals beside them, laughed in living rooms where I thought I belonged. Seeing my name twisted into the role of a villain stung in a quiet, sour way. It wasn't the accusation itself. It was the ease with which they abandoned the version of me they knew. Loyalty, I realized, sometimes had nothing to do with truth. Sometimes it only followed blood. His sister's message was longer, carefully worded to sound supportive while still assigning blame. "Don't make him look bad," she wrote. "He's already struggling. Don't add to it." I stared at the line, surprised by its familiarity. Those were the same words I'd said to myself for years. Protect his dignity. Soften the truth. Don't push too hard. They didn't know they were reciting a story I'd already been trapped in. I clicked my phone off and placed it face down, feeling the old pull of obligation tug at me. but it tugged weaker than before, like a rope that had frayed over time. I wasn't responsible for managing their comfort anymore. I wasn't responsible for cushioning the truth. I opened the folder again and took a slow breath. Instead of replying to anyone, I sent a single image. My payroll record from the year he'd made no income. No explanation, no commentary, just the evidence. The message delivered instantly but remained unread for a long stretch. When his sister finally responded with a hesitant, "Oh," I felt something unclench inside me. Not satisfaction, just release. Even that small acknowledgement, that crack in their certainty, reaffirmed what I already knew. Once confronted with facts, the drama deflates. I didn't need them to apologize. I didn't even need them to understand me. I just needed the truth to land somewhere other than my own hands. A memory rose uninvited. His mother saying, years ago, "A woman who is too strong ends up alone." I had laughed then, brushing it off, thinking it was old-fashioned advice. But a part of me absorbed it, tucked it away like a warning label stitched into my decisions. I realized now how deeply it had shaped me, how often I had softened myself to avoid appearing too strong, how often I had stayed quiet to stay likable. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had weakened myself to protect a relationship that still failed. Strength hadn't doomed me. Silence had. I looked at the stack of documents on the table. Real, unembellished, steady. They weren't a weapon. They were a mirror. And I was finally ready to look into it without flinching. This wasn't just about proving contributions or defending my name. It was about reclaiming the parts of me I had traded away in the name of peace. I smoothed the edges of the folder and felt a calm certainty settle in. I wasn't doing this out of spite. I wasn't doing it to punish him or embarrass his family. I was doing it to anchor myself in reality after years of drifting in someone else's version of it. I closed the folder and slid it into my bag. The decision was made, not in anger but in clarity. Their words, accusations, pleas, warnings, no longer dictated my choices. I didn't owe them explanations or comfort, only the truth. And the truth, finally, was organized, documented, and undeniable. I stood up from the table, letting the quiet fill the room again. With a steady breath, I whispered to myself, "This is my life to tell." Then I turned off the lights and walked away from the noise that wasn't mine to carry anymore. The mediation room was quiet except for the hum of the copy machine warming up in the corner. The mediator, calm, composed, unreadable, gestured for us to sit. My ex avoided my eyes, his jaw tight, his shoulders pulled back, as if pretending he felt taller would make it true. When the mediator turned to me and asked if I had a response to the accusation that I had contributed little to the household, I inhaled slowly. No theatrics, no speeches. I slid the folder across the table with a steady hand. Its weight landed gently, but the sound carried a shift in the room. "These are my employment and financial records for the last 5 years, I said. My voice didn't rise or waver. It simply existed, firm, grounded, clear. The mediator opened the binder, flipping through the pages with professional detachment. But beneath the composure, I saw a subtle change. The pauses between page turns grew slightly longer. His eyebrows dipped just enough to show he understood the significance of what he was holding. Numbers don't lie. Timelines don't bend for sentiment. Meanwhile, my ex sat stiffly, glancing at the documents with a tension that edged into panic. The mediator's pen slowed over a page of tax forms, lingering on the lines where my earnings stood alone. The silence thickened, not uncomfortable, just truthful. I kept my hands folded in my lap, breathing evenly, allowing the facts to speak without my help. "I worked throughout the marriage," I said quietly when the mediator looked up. "I've been the primary earner most years. I didn't correct the narrative before because I didn't think it needed correcting." My ex shifted, crossing his arms, his mouth pulling into a defensive line. The mediator nodded slowly, absorbing the implications. "Your documentation is thorough," he said. "We'll need equivalent records from both sides." That line, calm and procedural, was the first crack in my ex's posture. His foot tapped under the table, barely visible but enough to show the tension underneath. I didn't lean forward. I didn't add anything else. I simply stayed steady. Then the mediator asked him directly, "Do you have income records, bank statements, or proof of your financial contributions for the same period?" The question hung in the air like a blade. My ex hesitated, his throat bobbed. I don't have everything with me today," he muttered. "Some things are hard to gather." It wasn't a lie. It wasn't quite the truth either. It was the echo of a narrative losing its structure. The mediator didn't challenge him immediately. He simply wrote something down, the pen scratching softly across the paper. The sound felt louder than it was. My breathing deepened, not from triumph, but from a quiet, steady sadness. I had imagined this moment differently once, thinking truth would feel like vindication. Instead, it felt like watching the last threads of something fray apart. This wasn't a win. It wasn't even a turning point I wanted. It was just necessary. The mediator reviewed another page, then closed the binder. "We'll need to reassess the division based on verified contributions," he said. The words were neutral, but the outcome was inevitable. My ex finally looked at me, his expression brittle, his eyes carrying something that resembled fear. Or maybe recognition. I didn't look away. I didn't soften the moment for him. I simply met his gaze with the calm steadiness I had rebuilt, piece by piece. Then I nodded once, signaling nothing more than acknowledgement. No anger, no revenge, just truth. As the mediator organized the next steps, I felt a strange peace wash through me. Not relief, but alignment. I had carried the truth alone for years. Now it was on the table, visible to everyone in the room. When the session ended, I gathered my folder with gentle hands, as if handling something finally honored. I stood, inhaled deeply, and stepped out of the room with a spine that felt fully mine again. The mediator began the next session with a single request, that my ex provide his own income documents. The air tightened as the words hung between us. My ex reached into his bag, rummaging with a nervous energy that overflowed into the room. What he finally placed on the table wasn't a folder, not even a stack. Just a few loose papers, some crumpled at the edges, others printed so faintly the numbers were barely visible. The mediator examined them with the same calm scrutiny he'd given mine, but the contrast was undeniable. "Do you have full records for all 5 years?" he asked. My ex hesitated, eyes darting downward. "Not on me," he muttered. The mediator didn't respond right away. He simply turned to the next page in my binder, the silence speaking louder than any confrontation. My ex tried to recover ground by shifting the narrative. "I contributed emotionally," he said, the words tumbling out too quickly. "I kept the household running. I supported her mentally." It was the same abstract argument he'd sent in messages, polished slightly but still empty. The mediator listened, then asked, "And do you have any written documentation of financial contributions?" The question was gentle but precise. My ex stiffened. "You know emotional labor counts too," he snapped, a defensive edge cutting through. But even he seemed to know it wasn't enough, not in this room, not under this scrutiny. His voice faltered, collapsing inward. The mediator nodded politely but moved on, noting his response without validating it. My ex's frustration simmered just below the surface, visible in the way his fingers tapped restlessly against the table. The mediator turned back to me. "And these," he said, gesturing to the binder, "are verified payments you made during the year your husband was unemployed." I nodded, sliding forward the receipts and bank statements from that period. My ex inhaled sharply, a sound caught between denial and dread. He leaned forward, squinting at the dates as if seeing them for the first time. "I didn't ask her to do all that," he whispered, tone softening into something unfamiliar, regret maybe. The mediator didn't correct him. He didn't need to. The documents made the truth plain. I watched the realization wash over my ex, not as a moment of humility, but as a slow unraveling of the story he'd been clinging to. "Why didn't you tell me you covered those months?" he asked suddenly, directing the question at me without anger, just confusion. I held his gaze. "I didn't think it needed to be said," I replied softly. "We were married. I filled in where you couldn't." His expression flickered, wounded in a way that surprised me. For a moment he looked like the man I remembered, the one who once thanked me for small things, before pride hardened the space between us. "I thought," he began, but the sentence trailed off, unfinished. Pride had once been his refuge. Now it was betraying him. The mediator waited patiently, allowing the silence to settle around the unspoken truths. When he finally spoke again, his voice was low. "I didn't realize how much you did." The confession wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even an apology. It was simply honest. And it hit harder than anger ever had. I didn't respond. There was nothing I could say that wouldn't reopen old wounds. Instead, I watched him look down at the paperwork, the numbers reflecting back a version of our marriage he had never seen, one where I had carried more than half of the weight, quietly, steadily, without asking for recognition. His shoulders dropped, deflated. The mediator cleared his throat gently, acknowledging the shift without lingering on it. "We'll adjust the division accordingly," he said, and the words landed with quiet finality. My ex lowered his head, whispering, "I'm sorry." So softly the words barely reached across the table. Not a performance, not a negotiation tactic. Just a man sitting with the discomfort of seeing himself clearly, for the first time in years. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. His apology wasn't for me. It was for the truth he had avoided. I rested my hands on the table, steady and still, feeling no triumph, no bitterness, only a quiet acceptance. The mediator gathered his notes and marked the session complete. When I stood, I felt lighter, not because I had won, but because the weight of unspoken truth had finally shifted off my shoulders and onto neutral ground. I walked out with a calm that felt earned. The next mediation session began with numbers, clean, unflinching, indifferent to emotion. The mediator recalculated the asset division based on verified contributions from both sides. My binder lay open on the table, its pages neatly aligned, while my ex sat beside a thin stack of papers that suddenly looked painfully inadequate. As the mediator went through each year, income, expenses, debt repayment, household costs, the percentage shifted steadily, inevitably. My portion rose, his declined. The math wasn't cruel, it was simply accurate. Watching the numbers tilt wasn't satisfying. It felt like standing on level ground after years of leaning sideways without noticing. I breathed in slowly, then exhaled. Not relief, just recognition. When the mediator announced the provisional split, I didn't react. I kept my hands folded, my posture calm. My ex stared at the table, jaw tight, doing the internal arithmetic of pride and loss. "It's that much," he whispered. The mediator nodded, factual and steady. Based on the verified data, yes. The room fell quiet except for the soft hum of the heater against the wall. I didn't offer comfort, and I didn't shrink. For once, I allowed the truth to stand without cushioning it. Not because I wanted him hurt, but because his feelings could no longer dictate the story. My stillness surprised me. It felt like a kind of maturity I hadn't realized I'd grown into. He finally lifted his eyes to meet mine. Could you ease up a little? The question wasn't accusatory. It was tired, stripped of the bravado he used to hide behind. I studied his face, the exhaustion in it, the shame tugging at the corners of his mouth. A part of me felt the old pull to soften, to make things easier, to shoulder emotional weight out of habit. But that reflex didn't rise anymore. We'll divide according to what each of us contributed, I said quietly. The fairness of that seemed to land with a heaviness he wasn't prepared for. He rubbed his forehead, nodding slowly as if rehearsing acceptance 1 inch at a time. I just didn't think it would look like this, he said, voice cracking at the edges. I believed him. He hadn't imagined himself on the losing side. He hadn't imagined a version of our history where the spotlight shifted. The mediator clarified. This is not punitive. This reflects documented reality. The simple truth of that fractured something small in my ex's expression. Pride is a stubborn thing. It doesn't shatter cleanly, it splinters. The splinters were visible now. His throat tightened, his gaze dipping again to the pages. I felt a soft tug of empathy, fleeting but real. Not enough to alter the numbers, but enough to acknowledge the humanity in the moment. As the mediator recalculated a few more items, I caught myself watching his hands. Hands I had once trusted, once reached for in crowded rooms. Now they trembled slightly as he tried to steady the papers. The sight didn't reopen old wounds. Instead, it closed something gently. He wasn't a villain. He was a man who had let insecurity write the ending to a marriage that had long been starved of honesty. I felt a quiet ache, but not for us. Just for the years that could have been different if either of us had been brave enough to speak plainly sooner. The mediator's voice broke through my thoughts, confirming the final adjustments. When the session ended, he lingered at the table, staring at the numbers that no longer bent in his favor. There was no anger in his face, just a worn-out acceptance. I gathered my binder with careful hands, not rushed, not triumphant, just steady. He didn't look up as I stood, and I didn't wait for him to. Some closures don't need a conversation. They just need truth placed gently where denial used to sit. I turned toward the door, feeling the weight of the last few years settle, not heavily, but firmly, like a book closing on the final chapter. As I stepped into the hallway's soft light, a quiet thought rose. I didn't need fairness to be loud. I only needed it to be real. The garage felt colder that evening, the kind of chill that settles into the air after a long day of confronting truths. I stood by the work table, the binder open in front of me, its pages illuminated in a pale wash of overhead light. As I turned another page, a thought surfaced, clear, steady, and quietly firm. I have given enough. I traced a line of text with my finger, remembering the years when giving too much had felt like the only way to keep the peace. But this time, something inside me anchored deeper. Not today, I whispered. Not anymore. I straightened my shoulders, feeling a new kind of resolve settle in. It wasn't anger, it wasn't revenge, it was self-recognition finally catching up to me. At the mediation office earlier, my attorney had finalized the session paperwork, signing his name with the brisk efficiency of someone used to closure. I watched the pen glide across the page and felt an unexpected heaviness lift from my chest. It was official. My work, my records, my years of quiet labor were acknowledged. Not praised, not celebrated, just acknowledged. And strangely, that was enough. As the mediator stamped the documents, the sound echoed in the quiet room. a small but decisive punctuation on years of imbalance. I collected my copy and tucked it into my bag, hand steady, heart surprisingly calm. Legal recognition didn't erase the past, but it reframed it in a way that felt fair. Walking out of the building afterward, I felt a wave of fatigue wash over me. Not the kind that comes from exertion, but the emotional kind that follows a long period of holding yourself together. The sky outside was a muted gray, hinting at rain, and I paused for a moment under the awning, letting the cool air touch my face. A strange mixture of relief and sorrow moved through me. Winning didn't feel triumphant. It felt like exhaling after holding my breath for too long. I wasn't joyful. I wasn't proud. I was simply at peace with the truth being visible, finally, to someone other than me. When I glanced back into the conference room before leaving, I saw him gathering his papers quietly. He didn't look at me. His shoulders were rounded, his movements small. It was the posture of someone absorbing a truth he didn't want but could no longer deny. I watched him for half a second, not long enough for him to notice, just long enough for me to see that the anger he'd wielded so freely had drained away. What was left wasn't bitterness. It was fear, and maybe a little shame. For the first time in years, I didn't feel responsible for soothing it. He would have to carry his own truths now. Back home in the garage, I closed the binder gently, pressing the cover down with the flat of my palm. The pages inside were no longer just evidence. They had become a record of my resilience. My ex's avoidance, his defensiveness, his rewriting of our past. None of it held power over me anymore. I understood now that strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet insistence on seeing things clearly. Sometimes it's the decision to stop shrinking. I reached for a folder tab and adjusted it by a fraction of an inch, restoring the neatness I relied on. Order wasn't just a habit. It was how I reclaimed control. A soft hum from the overhead light filled the garage as I gathered the documents into a single stack. I wasn't angry at him, truly, I wasn't. I wasn't even triumphant. I just felt done. Done carrying the blame. Done absorbing the revision of history. Done apologizing for truths that were always mine. As I closed the storage box and slid it back onto the shelf, I felt something settle inside me. Quiet, but certain. I had stood my ground. Not to win, but to honor myself. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. I turned off the light, letting the garage fall into a calm darkness, and walked back inside with a spine that no longer bowed. The final negotiation meeting was scheduled for late afternoon, the kind of hour when the light slants low and everything feels slightly suspended. He arrived early, waiting in the hallway with his hands buried in his pockets. When I approached, he didn't raise his voice or launch into accusations. Instead, he spoke quietly. I need a clause. Something that won't make me look bad. It wasn't arrogance this time. It was vulnerability wrapped in a thin layer of pride. A request made by someone trying to salvage a fragment of dignity. I studied him for a moment. The man in front of me wasn't the one who had hurled accusations weeks earlier. He looked tired, older, softened by the weight of the truth he could no longer outrun. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to absorb his discomfort. We stepped into the room and the mediator began outlining the final details. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't hesitate. I want an agreement that he won't make false claims about me in the future, I said. No bitterness, no raised voice, just a boundary. Clear, fair, firm, necessary. My ex looked over, startled by the precision of it. I wasn't planning, he began, but the mediator held up a hand. It's a reasonable request. The words landed like a stamp on the table. I didn't watch his reaction. I kept my gaze forward, hands folded. Setting a boundary didn't feel confrontational. It felt like finally choosing myself without apology. A quiet power I hadn't known I had. He exhaled slowly, the sound thin but honest. "You're strong," he said. Not with resentment, but with a new kind of recognition. A tone that didn't belong to the man who once dismissed my work or questioned my value. I met his gaze briefly, then answered, "I'm clear." The difference mattered. Clarity isn't aggression. It doesn't need to overpower anything. It simply stands. And in that moment, I realized how much of my life I had spent trying to make myself softer so he wouldn't feel small. This time I didn't shrink, and the world didn't collapse. The mediator wrote down the new clause, the pen gliding with finality across the page. He asked for a moment to step outside, and when he returned, there was a noticeable shift in his posture. Less resistance, more acceptance, maybe even relief. "Okay," he said quietly. "I agree." He didn't hide behind bravado or excuses. He didn't try to renegotiate. He simply agreed. The simplicity of it washed over me, more profound than any apology. For years, clarity had been the one thing we never reached together. Now, in this small room with neutral walls, it finally settled between us. Not warm, not hostile, just unmistakably real. The mediator added the clause formally, reading it aloud for the record. A commitment that neither party would misrepresent the other going forward. Listening to it spoken aloud felt strangely emotional. It wasn't just a legal line, it was a reclaiming, a promise that my silence would no longer be interpreted as permission. A document that said, plainly, my truth will not be rewritten again. My ex nodded along, shoulders slightly slumped but no longer in denial. He seemed lighter, too, as if finally acknowledging the truth brought its own strange form of release. Maybe letting go of the narrative freed him in ways he didn't expect. When the session ended, I gathered my folder calmly, not rushed, not triumphant, just grounded. He lingered a moment, looking like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I didn't push him. Some things don't need to be voiced to be understood. I stepped into the hallway, feeling the air shift around me, the soft quiet of something ending cleanly. As I walked toward the exit, the weight that had sat on my shoulders for years lifted. Not all at once, but in steady, certain increments. I wasn't leaving the building with victory. I was leaving with boundaries. And that felt stronger than any win could. The first thing I did the next morning was pull the secondary credit card from my wallet, the one with his name embossed beneath mine. For years it had traveled everywhere with me, tucked behind receipts and grocery lists, a quiet reminder of the life we once shared. I held it between my fingers for a long moment, feeling its familiar weight. Then, without ceremony, I dialed the number on the back and asked the representative to close the account and remove him permanently. My voice was steady, almost calm. When she confirmed the cancellation, I thanked her and ended the call. The silence that followed felt different from the silences I used to carry. This one wasn't avoidance. It was relief, stretching its limbs inside my chest. By afternoon, I was at the bank, signing papers to separate our joint account. The teller offered a sympathetic smile as she handed me the form. "It happens," she murmured. I nodded, not because I needed reassurance, but because I finally didn't. I filled out the paperwork slowly, each signature feeling like a soft reclaiming of space I had forgotten belonged to me. When the account officially closed, I exhaled, realizing only then how long I had held my breath around shared finances. Our money had tied us together long after our marriage had come undone. Cutting that final thread didn't sting. It steadied me. For the first time in years, everything I earned, everything I managed, everything I held would be solely mine. That evening, back in the garage, I opened the storage drawer where documents from the last 5 years had been mixed together. His letters, old tax forms, car repair bills, insurance papers. I sifted through them carefully, pulling out anything tied to the marriage and placing it in a separate box. What remained were items that belonged only to me: my certifications, my performance reviews, my savings receipts. I hadn't looked at these in a long time. Seeing them now made something warm expand beneath my ribs. These papers weren't just financial. They were the trail markers of the woman I had been before everything blurred. I stacked them neatly, labeling each section, and felt an unexpected surge of pride. Not loud, not dramatic, just solid. When I finally took a breath and stepped back, the garage looked different, cleaner, calmer, as if the space itself had been holding its breath with me. I gathered the small box of marital remnants, wedding photos, old rental contracts, the grocery list we'd scribbled the night we first moved in together. I didn't throw them away. I didn't need to. I simply placed them in a separate corner, a quiet archive of a life I no longer lived. There was no anger in the movement, just acceptance. We had shared a chapter. It closed. I wasn't erasing it. I was just shelving it where it belonged. I walked toward the tool shelf and noticed my old toolbox, blue metal, slightly rusted along the hinges. I hadn't opened it in years, not since I'd let him take over every minor repair under the guise of protecting me from strain. I lifted the lid, inhaling the faint scent of cold steel and oil. My own handwriting was still on the inside flap, marking socket sizes and drill bits. I brushed my fingers along it, feeling a softness spread across my chest. This was a part of me I had let go without noticing, not out of inability, but out of convenience. His convenience. I snapped the box shut with a firm click. I wasn't giving pieces of myself away anymore. As I closed the garage for the night, a quiet thought rose inside me. Simple, steady, undeniable. I have taken my name back. Not legally, not financially, emotionally. I wasn't tied to his story, his expectations, his perception of what I contributed or failed to. I was standing on my own ground again. When I turned off the light, the room fell into a peaceful dark, untouched by the old weight that used to live there. I stepped inside the house with a calm I didn't have to earn through exhaustion. It simply existed, like it had been waiting for me to claim it. The email from the mediator arrived just after sunrise. Its subject line clean and direct. Final contribution assessment. I opened it at the kitchen counter, the quiet of the morning still holding the house like a soft envelope. The attached document laid everything out in neat columns: earnings, expenses, documented payments, verified records from both sides. My share was significantly higher. There was no flourish, no commentary, just arithmetic, reflecting years of effort I had almost forgotten to honor. I read it twice, then a third time, letting the numbers seep into the corners of my understanding. This wasn't generosity from the legal system, nor leniency. It was accuracy. And accuracy, it turned out, felt gentler than vindication. He signed his portion later that afternoon without adding a single protest. No sarcastic remarks, no last-minute rewriting of the past. Just a quiet signature and a small nod, as if acknowledging something he'd resisted for too long. When the mediator confirmed receipt, the room felt strangely still, as though the air was adjusting to a new equilibrium. My ex sat back in his chair, eyes lowered, his breathing slow and deliberate. I watched him, not out of triumph, but with a soft, resigned compassion. He wasn't fighting anymore, and I wasn't holding my breath. The silence between us wasn't tense or bitter. It was simply the end of a long, uneven sentence finally reaching its period. As I reviewed my own signature on the document, I realized how different this moment felt from what I'd imagined. I wasn't triumphant. I wasn't exhilarated or vindicated. What I felt was a quiet, steady focus, like stepping onto solid ground after months of walking across unstable flooring. The legal signature didn't just close a financial chapter. It closed the emotional one that had run parallel to it, the one tangled with old guilt and misplaced responsibility. I set the pen down gently, letting the weight of the moment settle through my fingertips. Winning wasn't the right word. It wasn't even the right concept. This wasn't a win, it was alignment. When I looked up, my ex was staring out the window, his face softened in a way I hadn't seen in years. "I didn't realize how much you carried," he said quietly. Not as an apology, not as an appeal, just a statement spoken into the thinning air between us. It was honest, and it was late, but it was real. I didn't respond. Some truths didn't need answers. Some simply needed space to land. The mediator collected the paperwork, his movements efficient, respectful of the gravity in the room. When he thanked us for our professionalism, I felt a faint hum of closure, small but certain. As I gathered my folders, I felt a deep steadiness form in my chest, something like breath returning to a place that had been constricted for too long. Each document slid neatly back into place, no longer heavy, no longer burdened with the emotional weight they once carried. They weren't evidence of pain now. They were proof of survival, of clarity, of endurance. I closed the binder and felt its weight shift naturally into my hand. The first inhale after that felt fuller, like my ribs had finally found room to expand. For the first time in years, my body felt like it belonged entirely to me. When I stepped out of the building, the evening light was beginning to thin, casting soft shadows across the pavement. I walked slowly toward my car, not because I was tired, but because I wanted to absorb the stillness settling around me. The binder tucked at my side no longer felt like armor. It was simply a record of a chapter I had finished, with both clarity and grace. I opened the car door, placed the binder on the passenger seat, and sat for a long moment before turning the key. The world outside looked the same, but I wasn't. I had regained something I didn't know I'd lost. My breath, my balance, my name. And as I pulled away, I felt unmistakably, profoundly whole. When I got home that evening, the house felt unusually quiet. Not empty, but settled, as if it had exhaled after holding tension for too long. I set the binder on the dining table and opened my laptop, creating a new digital folder labeled simply Verified Records. One by one, I scanned each document, pay stubs, tax forms, account statements, and saved them with precise file names. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't even caution. It was preservation. A way of ensuring that the truth lived somewhere permanent, somewhere untouched by memory's tendency to blur. As I watched each file upload, a sense of control returned to me. Not forceful, not defensive, just steady. Keeping these records wasn't about the past anymore. It was about honoring the woman who had lived through it. After finishing, I sent a short email to the mediator. "Thank you for your fairness and professionalism." It was a simple sentence, but I meant every word. His objectivity had been a small anchor in weeks full of shifting ground. When his reply came minutes later, "It was my privilege to assist, wishing you clarity moving forward." I felt warmth rise unexpectedly in my chest, not because I needed reassurance, but because fairness, when you've gone without it for so long, feels like a rare and steady light. I closed my laptop gently, letting the screen fade to black, and sat back in my chair, absorbing the stillness. I walked out to the garage next, peeling the old timeline from the wall. The printed sheets, once crowded with arrows and highlights, came off easily now. I folded each one carefully before placing them into a box marked Archive. They didn't weigh anything anymore, not emotionally, not symbolically. They were simply references, proof of a chapter I no longer needed displayed in front of me. When the wall was bare, I stepped back and studied the clean space. The emptiness didn't feel like loss. It felt like possibility. A blank surface, waiting for something new, something of my choosing. I rested my palm against the cool wall, letting the simplicity sink in. The garage felt wider after that, quieter in a peaceful way. I returned to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, watching the steady stream fill the cup. Even my hands felt different, less tense, less shaky, as though they finally recognized themselves again. I took a sip, noticing how the cold grounded me. The past few weeks had been a long unraveling, but they had also been a stitching back together of parts I'd forgotten about. As I leaned against the counter, I felt my breathing slow into an easy rhythm, the kind that comes when your body finally realizes the crisis has passed. I moved through the house with a calm familiarity, noticing small things I hadn't paid attention to in years. The way the evening light touched the living room rug, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the soft flutter of curtains moving with the faintest breeze. These mundane details felt new, as if I were meeting my home again for the first time. I filled my glass again, not out of thirst, but as a gesture of grounding. Each sip felt like reclaiming something: space, breath, self. In the quiet, my mind drifted not to what had been lost, but to what had returned. Stability, clarity, dignity. By the time I sat down at the edge of the couch, the weight of the past weeks felt distant, like the final echo of a storm that had already passed over. I smiled, a small, private smile that didn't need an audience. For once, the quiet didn't feel threatening or lonely. It felt earned. I had walked myself through a maze of accusation and memory, through truth and hesitation, until I found the exit that belonged only to me. And now, sitting in the soft glow of my living room, I felt something unmistakable. Peace. The kind you don't chase. The kind that arrives when the truth finally has room to breathe. His message arrived just as I was preparing dinner, short, unembellished, stripped of the bravado that used to lace his words. "I'm sorry," I panicked. I was afraid I'd end up with nothing. I stared at the screen, letting the sentence settle without rushing to interpret it. The tone was different this time. Not sharp, not defensive, just human. I leaned against the counter, the faint aroma of simmering broth filling the room. His fear didn't surprise me anymore. I'd felt its tremors beneath every argument, every accusation. But seeing it named so plainly softened something inside me. Not toward reconciliation, but toward understanding. People don't always lash out because they're cruel. Sometimes they lash out because they're scared of their own reflection. I typed a brief reply, nothing more than a link to the final asset agreement. No commentary, no emotional interpretation. Facts were the only language we could share now without reopening wounds. When I hit send, I felt neither cold nor dismissive, just clear. The document said everything that needed saying. I had learned painfully that not every sincere message requires a heartfelt answer. Sometimes the kindest thing you can offer is clarity. I placed the phone face down on the table and stirred the pot gently, listening to the quiet bubbling rise like a steady heartbeat. Letting him carry responsibility for his words was not cruelty. It was balance. As the evening light dimmed, I found myself reflecting, not on the marriage, but on the long stretch of fear I had lived under without noticing. Fear of conflict. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of appearing unkind. It had shaped me more than the relationship itself. Now, standing barefoot in my own kitchen with the steady rhythm of cooking around me, that fear felt distant, like a language I no longer spoke. The silence didn't pressure me anymore. It wrapped gently around the room, warm and spacious. I took a slow breath, realizing how long it had been since my thoughts belonged completely to me, unfiltered, unhushed. When I sat down to eat, the house felt different, lighter, as if the walls had shifted to accommodate a version of me with steadier shoulders. I glanced at the garage door down the hallway, remembering the years of clutter, the timelines taped to the wall, the arguments muffled under fluorescent light. It felt like a past life, not erased, not denied, just distant. I took another bite of dinner, tasting each flavor more clearly than I had in months. Stress had a way of muting everything: color, sound, appetite. Peace, I was learning, sharpened the senses. It brought life back into focus. After washing the dishes, I returned to the dining table and opened the printed asset agreement. The stark lettering no longer intimidated me. It simply reflected what was real. The truth, when finally acknowledged, didn't feel heavy. It felt orderly. I traced the edges of the paper lightly, surprised by the gratitude welling up in me. Not for the conflict, but for the clarity it forced me to find. I no longer feared what he thought of me. I no longer feared the shadows of accusation. I had faced them, sifted through them, and walked out the other side intact. I folded the agreement and placed it in a folder on the shelf, its final home. Then I closed the shelf door softly, the click echoing with a sense of finality that didn't hurt. I stood in the quiet for a moment, letting the stillness wash over me. I had survived something I never planned for. I had learned to speak a truth I once avoided. And I had done it without cruelty, without shouting, without losing myself. As I turned off the dining room light and walked toward the bedroom, my steps felt lighter than they had in years. I wasn't just ending something tonight. I was stepping into a space where I no longer feared my own voice. It was the garage that called me back the next morning. The quiet space where this entire unraveling and rebuilding had begun. Sunlight slipped through the narrow window, catching dust in the air, softening the edges of the room. I opened the door slowly, half expecting the weight of memory to press against me. But it didn't. The room greeted me with an uncommon calm, as if it too had settled into its new shape. The work table was cleared except for the storage box I'd left the night before. I approached it unhurriedly, resting my fingers on the lid before lifting it. Inside were the remnants of a marriage, documents, photos, small tokens from places we'd visited. I sifted through them not as someone aching to remember, but as someone learning to let go. Every item had a story. Every story had a lesson. And I felt no fear touching any of them now. In the corner of the box lay a small stack of letters, notes he'd written early in our marriage, when sincerity still outweighed insecurity. I read one, its ink slightly faded, the handwriting unmistakably his. There was affection in the words, earnestness even. And for a brief moment, I remembered the tenderness we once had. It didn't hurt. It didn't pull me backward. It simply reminded me that our story hadn't been all shadows. There had been warmth once. Real warmth. But love without honesty eventually collapses under its own weight. I folded the letter again and placed it back neatly, noticing how my hands didn't shake. Closure didn't need bitterness. Sometimes it looked like recognizing the good without pretending it was enough. I continued sorting, organizing, labeling, deciding. Some papers went into the recycling pile, others into the archive. A few personal items I placed in a smaller box, not because I needed them, but because I wanted to preserve the parts that mattered without letting them define me. As I worked, a rhythm formed, steady, unhurried, almost meditative. The garage didn't feel like a battleground anymore. It felt like a place of transition, somewhere between who I had been and who I was becoming. I stood back and took in the sight of the newly arranged shelves, the clearer floor, the open space around me. The physical order mirrored the internal one I had fought so hard to reclaim. When I reached for the final set of documents, a memory surfaced of an argument years ago, one where he insisted he always had more responsibility, where my contributions were dismissed with a casual wave. I remembered standing in this very garage afterward, gripping the edge of the table to steady myself, wondering if I was imagining my own value. That memory rose now like a distant echo, softened by time but unmistakable in its weight. I didn't feel anger toward it. I felt gratitude, because that moment had planted the earliest seed of doubt in his narrative, doubt in the version of myself I had been told to shrink into. Without that moment, I might never have reached this one. I placed the last folder into the archive box and exhaled deeply. The breath left my body slowly, as if releasing years of tension molecule by molecule. I closed the lid gently, securing it with steady hands. The box wasn't a coffin for the past. It was simply storage for a story that had run its course. I stepped back, taking in the garage from a new angle. It looked brighter somehow, not because anything had changed physically, but because I had. The room no longer held me hostage. It simply held history, a history I could visit without drowning in it. Before leaving, I paused at the doorway, letting my fingers rest on the frame. The morning light filled the space behind me, touching the boxes, the shelves, the table where so much truth had been uncovered. I realized then that my life was no longer tangled in proving anything, to him, to his family, or even to myself. The truth had already done the work. All I had to do now was live in it. I turned off the garage light, feeling the quiet settle around me like a soft closing note. Then I walked inside the house, carrying nothing but the calm certainty that the woman stepping forward was no longer the woman who had once stood here in doubt. The afternoon was quiet when the final notification arrived. A simple email confirming that all documents had been processed, approved, and officially filed. No ceremony, no dramatic flourish. Just a clean confirmation that the long chapter was closed. I sat on the edge of my bed, letting the weight of the message settle into my chest. There was no rush of adrenaline, no triumphant surge. Instead, a calm warmth spread through me, steady and grounding. I closed my eyes and breathed in the slow, measured air of a life no longer held together by tension. The silence in the room didn't feel empty. It felt spacious, ready to be filled with something new. For the first time in years, the future didn't look like a problem to manage. It looked like an open door. I walked through the house with a lightness I hadn't felt in a long time. Each room carried familiar echoes, conversations, small fights, reconciliations that only solved half the problem. But now, the echoes felt distant, like a movie played in another lifetime. I passed by the dining table where I had once compiled documents until midnight, the living room where arguments softened into uneasy silence, the kitchen where I'd swallowed my questions to keep the peace. Today, those spaces didn't tug at me. They simply watched me walk by, quiet, unburdened. I paused by the window, letting the soft wind brush against my face. The world outside went on as usual, but something inside me had shifted entirely. Peace, I realized, was not the absence of conflict. It was the presence of clarity. Later, I sat on the couch with a cup of tea warming my hands. The steam curled gently into the air, soft and unhurried. I let myself reflect, not on the pain or the confusion, but on the long stretch of strength I hadn't given myself credit for. I had survived so much more than arguments and accusations. I had survived erasure, doubt, the quiet pressure to make myself smaller so someone else could feel whole. And, in the process of defending the truth, I had uncovered parts of myself I thought I'd lost. I traced the rim of the cup with my thumb, feeling pride settle in my chest. Not loud or boastful, but calm and sure. I had walked through fire without letting it burn my voice. A soft buzz pulled me from my thoughts. Another message, this one brief. Thank you for handling everything fairly. It was from him. I read it once, then set the phone aside without replying. Not out of bitterness, not out of pride, but because the story no longer required an ending shared between us. Some chapters close with conversation. Others close with silence. This one closed with understanding. I leaned back into the couch, letting my body sink into its cushions. There was no longer anything to defend, no narrative to correct. Just the quiet acknowledgement that we had finally reached the truth, even if it came late. I stood and walked toward the hallway, stopping in front of the garage door. For a moment I rested my hand on the cool metal surface, remembering the countless nights I had stood on the other side of it, confused, afraid, determined. That room had held every version of me, the uncertain wife, the quiet fighter, the woman gathering proof of her own life. Now it held only the past, a past I didn't resent, but one I no longer needed to live inside. I opened the door briefly, letting a wash of light spill across the floor. The space looked clean, orderly, almost peaceful. I smiled softly, whispered a small goodbye to the version of me who had once stood there trembling, and closed the door for the last time. As the evening settled in, I stepped outside onto the porch. The sky stretched wide and pale above me, brushed with the faint glow of fading daylight. I breathed in deeply, slow, full, unguarded. Life ahead didn't need to be perfect. It only needed to be mine. I walked down the steps, feeling the ground steady beneath my feet, each step lighter than the one before. I wasn't leaving something behind. I was stepping into something honest, something whole. And as I moved forward, the certainty took root, quietly but completely. I had reclaimed my story, not with fury, not with victory, with truth. And truth, I finally understood, was enough to build a life on. In the end, it wasn't the documents, the mediation sessions, or even the final signatures that changed me. It was the quiet moment afterward, when I realized I no longer felt the need to defend who I was. The truth had held its ground, gently and steadily, and I had learned to stand with it. I walked away from that chapter not as someone who won, but as someone who finally understood her own worth without needing permission, validation, or apology. Life didn't suddenly become perfect, but it became honest. And honesty, I learned, is its own kind of freedom. Now the house feels lighter. The rooms don't echo with tension. The garage isn't a battlefield, it's just a room again. And my life, slowly, quietly, has become mine again. If you've ever had to reclaim yourself piece by piece, you know exactly how powerful that moment is. I hope this story touched something in you, something soft, something strong, something ready to rise. Tell me in the comments, Which moment hit you the hardest? Your thoughts help others feel less alone. And if you want more stories like this, raw, honest, and deeply human, make sure you subscribe.